The Beast of the Barren Lakes. An unexplained news story that nobody wants to publish. Let's get straight into that. And when they came upon the clearing, the men were struck by fear, such that some among the men began wailing, for the beast they had seen fall dead with their own eyes, the beast into which 200 men had dispensed the contents of their rifles, was nowhere to be found. The beast of Gévaudan had survived to vanish right before their very eyes. Unknown author, circa 1785. I've always been into the strange and the mysterious. Stories of unknown beasts and weird phenomena drove me to study science and, when the reality of scientific work left me jarred and burnt out, to journalism. I make my living writing about the weird and wonderful things that make our world so interesting, whether historical or current, and that takes me all over the country and sometimes even further abroad. It seems, though, that there is someone who doesn't want this story getting out. No one will touch it, and even my own blog has mysteriously shut down after I posted part of it there. And so, I'm doing what any self-respecting freelancer would do, and turn into the wider internet. I have no idea who is suppressing it, or how, or why, but I need to get it out there. The story came to me completely by accident. I was researching a historical piece involving a supposed medium who operated in a rural New South Wales in the 1800s. When I came across a tiny snippet on the internet forum. The basic gist of it seemed to be that this farmer had been losing cattle in gruesome fashion, and at an alarming rate, and had reached his wit's end. He provided little more info than that, really. But for some reason, my intuition kicked in. I had planned to go out to the area anyway, do some interviews regarding my long-dead medium, and so a few extra kilometres and a few extra questions couldn't possibly hurt. Of course, I was slightly wrong about that. I sent the man a private message, wondering if he would ever see it, and packed up the laptop. Time to go. The drive out to Sydney would take quite a few hours, and I wanted to make it by nightfall. Most city folk find the drives away from Sydney being boring, except maybe for the coast roads. Once you clear the city and the mountains, if you happen to be heading far enough west, it's just endless rolling hills. Some of them are nothing but pasture, others nothing but brown, green bushland, and beyond those hills you hit the plains. For miles in every direction, nothing but dirt and pasture, dotted with the ancient gums. Personally, I think the dry country is every bit as beautiful as the more popular parts of Australia, and I always loved driving through it. When I arrived at my destination, a small town some 150 kilometres north of Griffith, the farmer had in fact sent me an email. He told me that he'd received no other responses, and that the killings had actually stopped in the months since his post. Still, he was just as puzzled as he had been originally, and keen to talk about it. I told him where I was staying, and he promised to meet me the next day. I spent the morning researching my medium piece, but once I sat down with the farmer, I realised that it might have to take a back seat to this new story. He and his wife met me downstairs at the country pub where I was staying. After introductions, Jack and his wife Mary, names changed obviously, sat down with a beer and told me and my recorder their tale. It started several months earlier. Jack had woken with the sun as usual and headed out to feed the cattle. There's not as many cattle farmers and sheep farmers out there that way, but pasture is pasture, and plenty of the relatively small hold grazers like Jack make it work. When he went out to the main paddock though, he noticed that the majority of the cattle beyond the fence had crammed into the far corner near the gate. That's weird behaviour. Cattle might live in a herd, but they still like their space. I've seen them huddle up like that during a storm or whatnot, when they get scared. So, I straight away figured something was up. Couldn't have guessed what though. From there, Jack took his ute deeper into the paddock heading to the feeders with his load of feed. And that's when he saw why the cattle had huddled into the corner of the fence line. I saw the crows first, but I knew what they meant. The way they were all down on the ground. We lose a few every year. It's part of the job. So I drove over there to see what had happened. Can't have an illness going through the herd, for example. So, I needed to work out why this steer had kicked it. He took a big gulp of his schooner, shaking his head subtly at the memory. It wasn't no illness that killed this steer, though. The ute scared off the crows, and all I seen was blood. Blood and meat. Looked like a butcher's shop on mince-making day. Occurred to me later I should have snapped some pics. But I didn't think of it at the time. Anyway, this fucking steer had been torn to bits. One leg over there, a head over here, another leg over there somewhere. Wasn't much big meat left either. Something had a good feed and none too fancy table manners. Now, out here, there's nothing I know of that would do that. We've got a problem with feral dogs, like most farming communities. But taking a full-grown healthy steer from a herd? I don't want to say it had never happened, but I've never seen it. We've got baits on the property too, and we've not seen a dog for maybe 2 years. Obviously, at the time, Mary and I still reckon that's the most likely culprit, right? So, I lay more baits, move the cattle out of the paddock, and don't think much of it. Jack got up to order another round at this point, and Mary and I made small talk in the interim. Where was I? Right. Next few weeks, we lost a few more the same way. It started to look like a problem, but we couldn't do a lot. Wouldn't say it was a real regular either. Sometimes 2 days between them, sometimes 4 or 5. Folks around town suggested stuff like patrolling the place at night, but that's not going to work when you've got to bust your balls for 10 hours on no sleep. This isn't one of those massive stations. I employ one part-time stocky, and my son helps out when things get hectic. Otherwise, it's all me. So we reported it to the coppers. Weird thing was, the locals were happy to look into it, but once they called in for some expert help, it all got stonewalled. Cops dropped it like warm beer and told us to leave it be. Anyway, one night there was a god-awful commotion outside the house. We had some cattle in the house paddock ready to move in the morning, and about 1 a.m. they started kicking up all sorts of hell. So, I grabbed the rifle out the gun safe and go out on the back deck. It's dark as the inside of a dog, and so I don't see much, but I can see the steers all gunning it towards one end of the paddock. Then off to the left there's this sound, right? Like a crunching, tearing sound. By this point I'm pretty much packing it, but I grab the mag light from next to the back door and shine it out that way anyway. Another big swig of his schooner, and his hands were shaking. Mary rests a hand on his shoulder. It takes me a second to work out what I'm looking at, but there's definitely something there. Big. It's just dark in shape, but when the lights hit it, and it turns to me, I realise I was looking at the back end of it. It's got the head of a steer in its mouth, torn clear off, but it's a long way off and I can't make out a lot of details. Just the rough size of it, maybe 7, 8 foot, and it's covered in black fur. Big eyes too, reflecting the torch. Went from orange to green as it moved, a bit like a dog or fox's eyes. But no dog or fox is that tall. It didn't like the light though. Made to come at me, so I shot at it. Honestly reckon I missed the thing, but it did the job anyway. Whatever that thing was, it dropped to all fours and shot through. Mary spoke up then. The next day we reported it to the police, but they didn't seem very interested. A few days later we got a visit from a couple of federal police fellows from Canberra. They were nice, but assured us that whatever Jack had seen must have been a misidentification, and that folks had been tracking a big pack of feral dogs through the area. Jack scoffed at that. I could cop the misidentification, maybe. I happily admit I was shitting my dacks, and that can fuck with you. But you can tell me why 2 feds needed to come all the way up here and tell me it was a dog. We got the locals, we got rangers, so why do 2 blokes from Canberra need to come out for a pack of dogs? The man had a point. I couldn't think of a good reason for the AFP to even concern themselves with some cattle deaths and feral dogs. Didn't matter in the end. Never saw the thing again. Although I did find a couple of roos torn up at the very edge of the property the next week. Since then, not a hair. Whatever it might have been, it looks like it's moved on. Heard tell of something else though. Week or 2 ago, something bad. I gently prompted him to continue as he looked around, as though making sure no one else was listening. My son helps me work out sometimes, but He's got a real job too. Works out of Griffith as a sales rep for one of those wineries. He was a couple of towns over, shilling booze as he does, when he hears this story. A couple of days before, a farmhand went missing out of one of the properties. A good kid, never in any trouble. Found his four-wheeler smashed up in one of the paddocks and no sign of the lad. They figured he must have just rolled it or something, struggled off to get help. Except that there were no tracks leading away from it. So they spread out looking for a sign. And they did find a track, but it wasn't from the young fellow. At this point, Jack pulled out his phone. Managed to get me a pic of what they found, sent through by my son. Ground at my place is too dry for any real sign lately, unless you got an indigenous tracker or some shit maybe. But out there, they got a few tracks. Here, take a gander. Jack handed over his phone. I almost dropped it in shock as the picture registered in my head. Smudges and smearing made it difficult to identify the exact kind of animal, but it was an image of a paw print. That much was clear. Possibly canine, based on the overall shape. But if the scout item against it was real, then that meant that the track in the photo had to be at least 20 centimetres long. I found myself needing a drink too. This is Australia. What the fuck sort of animal has a foot that big? The Beast of the Barren Lakes. An unexplained news story that nobody wants to publish. Part 2 of 6. Let's get straight into that. They had shot a wolf, an impressive specimen, but the beast described in the attacks around Jevildan did not resemble a wolf, and the villagers were unconvinced. They knew a wolf when they saw it, and none had ever met a wolf that could survive the barrage of ammunition their beast had sustained. When they cut the belly of the wolf open, a most gruesome task, I am sure, the villagers were sure. The last attack had been a mere hours earlier, yet no human remains could be found. The king and his men insisted they had killed the culprits, but the villagers around Jevildan still looked at the dark forest with fear. The beast of Jevildan, in their eyes, still lurked somewhere, out there. Thomas Walter Blake, in a personal letter, 1770. I'm sure you can see why this case sucked me in, even if it wound up being nothing. As someone who had been obsessed with the unexplained for my whole life, the parallels between this and other cases were hard to ignore. A whole lot of beastly encounters with unknown, vicious creatures had happened over the years, and there was a chance I might be smack in the middle of another. I had to visit the farm where the young worker had disappeared. Jack gave me the address and I headed out there the next day. A couple of hours' drive further west, there I met the owners, Terry and Grace, who were only too happy to put a cup of tea on and talk about their own strange experiences, although they didn't agree to be recorded and I had to take physical notes. I fashioned the below piece from those notes. It didn't start with Tom. The young farmhand's disappearance was the zenith of the activity, but it came after a fortnight or so of strange occurrences. First, Terry found every single chicken on the property slaughtered or outright gone. It would have been easy to attribute that crime to foxes, or perhaps the seemingly ubiquitous feral dogs. Except that an entire corrugated iron wall section had been torn off the large coop. Not many foxes can do that. Next came the cries, chilling sounds emanating from the bush behind the farm. They came late at night, carried on the still air, deeply resonant and almost demonic. Terry and Grace both heard them, as did several workers, and no one could honestly say they'd ever heard anything similar before. If not for the volume and the massive timber, the howls could almost be mistaken for a dingo, although dingoes had been wiped out many years earlier in the area. But the coughing, roars, and the chattering, ululating wails were not those of any animal that had ever been heard in Australia, native or otherwise. Grace described it as being how she'd always imagined the sound of hellhounds, or perhaps the infamous hound of the Baskervilles. There was a wrongness about that came through loud and clear with every call. They stopped going out at night, and they stopped locking up the guns. Laws be damned. Over the course of about a week, the sounds came and went. Sometimes they sounded unbearably close, and others they seemed to be carried from miles and miles away. And then Terry started finding corpses in the paddocks. Unlike Jack's cattle, these corpses seemingly weren't the result of predation. Terry runs massive herds of sheep and, for whatever reason, they started turning up decapitated. The corpses were otherwise unmolested, each sporting one massive traumatic injury that removed the head. They were also found in strange places, paddocks and yards without stock, hanging on fences or climbing pegs or power poles, on top of the hay bales in the feed paddocks, and even on top of a water tank somehow. And, chillingly, one morning Terry walked out the front door to find 4 decapitated kangaroos neatly lined up on his porch, thick blood seeping into the wooden decking. For most people that might have been the last straw, but Terry and Grace live off the land, and if they'd fled even for a few days, it could have cost them thousands in income. So, they stayed. They offered their 3 workers the opportunity to head into town, but all 3 refused. The morning of his disappearance, Tom woke early and ate in the kitchen, overlooking the paddocks all the way to the range of small hills several miles away. When Terry rose about half an hour later, Tom said he'd seen a large dark shape moving in the dawn light down by the creek. He resolved to head out on a 4-wheeler once the sun was higher and he could see if he could find any solid evidence of what they might be dealing with, anything that might help them get rid of it. Terry was reluctant to let him go. They had been waiting until later in the day to go outside, and they had been using the utes in case they came upon anything. But Tom was insistent, and at about 10 a.m. he gathered a few things into a pack and left. When he hadn't returned by 3 p.m, Terry became concerned. He and another worker, Grant, took one of their old utes out and followed the creek, hoping to find Tom. They came across the 4-wheeler right near the boundary of the property and the bush, irreparably damaged. Terry knew right away that something awful had happened to his young employee. The idea that he must have crashed, as relayed later by Jack a few hours away, came from the townsfolk. And of course, he could have crashed, but that can't have been all that happened. The 4-wheeler showed signs of an attack, for lack of a better word. 2 tyres were shredded as though by massive teeth, and certainly not a result of the gentle pastoral terrain. One wheel was torn off and lay quiet in a distance away, and what looked like claw marks raked over the red paint. Terry, fearful though he was, immediately began searching for tracks of Tom to see if he was still out there. He would be in serious danger, and that's when they found the huge prints. There were 5 semi-distinct impressions, and many, many others that were no more than marks on the ground where something heavy had passed through. All 5 were smeared heavily, potentially distorting their true size, but there was no doubt that even a half the size of the actual impression the foot would have been, far larger than any animal currently found anywhere in Australia, barring maybe an emu. And it clearly didn't come from an emu, a bird whose size belies how light it actually is. These tracks were made by something big, something solid and heavy. As much as he feared for Tom, Terry refused to follow those tracks into the bush, and instead he called the local police. But they couldn't make it out in time until the next morning, and by then there was no sign of Tom. Terry told the police everything that had been happening. He showed them the decapitated carcasses and the tracks, and, being local, they demonstrated a real concern. A search party looked for Tom for 2 days before someone found his pack, soaked in blood, on a game trail some 5 kilometres from where the 4-wheeler had been found. The search went on for another day or 2, but was called off soon after. Tom wasn't officially dead until a body could be found, but like so many who had gone missing in an Australian bush, there seemed to be little hope. As the search came to an end, 2 AFP officers in plain clothes visited the farm, in a curious parallel to the case with Jack a few towns over. They claimed to have been in the area and compelled to help with the search, but no one actually saw them out in the bush. Stranger, they were seen loading one of the decapitated sheep into the boot of their car before driving out of town. While something terrible had clearly happened to Tom, his disappearance seemed to signal the end of strange events. The monstrous sound stopped immediately, and no more headless corpses turned up, apart from a few that had obviously escaped notice originally. Judging by the level of decay, Terry and Grace mourned the young man, and they knew in their heads and hearts he'd been killed by something that shouldn't have been there. But whatever it was, it seemed to have moved on. They hadn't seen any evidence of it since, and no one else around the town had either. For them at least, the nightmare seemed to be over. Terry and Grace were a lovely couple, and they made for a great afternoon tea. But I couldn't help feeling unfulfilled as I left their farm and headed back to my accommodation. They had much more activity than Jack, who apparently frightened the creature off completely when he shot at it that night. And yet, I had no further answers, just a bunch more questions. Why did whatever Terry and Grace encountered make so much noise when Jack described it as moving through the night in complete silence? Why did it kill but not feed? And why did it put the bodies in the places it did? Why did it seemingly attack and kill Tom when it fled from Jack? Tom had been armed too. Were they even the same creature? It seemed unlikely that two large, unknown and terrible creatures would pop up in almost the same area. None of it made any sense, but as it turned out, the creature was far from finished. I would get more information sooner than I might have expected. The Beast of the Barren Lakes, an unexplained news story that nobody wants to publish. Part 3 of 6. Let's get straight into that. The men found Marie by the river, face down in the shallow water of the margins. The sight was said to have turned the stomach of even the bravest among them, the ragged stump of her neck still fresh and bleeding. They needn't approach any further, for the evidence was clear. The beast of Gévaudan had returned. Excerpt from a story related to Boris Makarov, 1826. I had left my number with Jack and Mary, and with Grace and Terry, and asked them to pass it on to anyone else who might have information for me. When my phone rang with an unknown number 2 days later, I did hope that it had to do with the strange beast that had quickly become my obsession. As I spoke to the woman on the other end of the line, my heart managed to both leap and sink at the same time. On the one hand, there had been another encounter. On the other, there had been another killing. And this time, there was a body. The attack had happened to the south this time, given the amount of time that had passed since the events of Grace and Terry's farm. It also seemed like I had underestimated the effect of this thing. The caller was a friend of one of the workers from the farm where Tom disappeared, and she told me that my number had basically been given to everyone in town. They were all terrified of the monster that lurked in the dark, and there were so many more encounters. More pressing, obviously, was the body. In a breathless rush, my contact told me the attack had happened at a river crossing. The victim, a 55-year-old man, had got out of his four-wheel drive, maybe to check the flow of the depth. Whatever the reason, he never got back in. His body was found next to the truck later on when another driver came through. The contact said the man had been torn in two, and that his head wasn't found at the scene. Understandably, the poor soul who made the grisly discovery didn't hang around and had since been treated for shock, but my contact said he would be willing to talk to me. He's shaken up, she said, but he's desperate to know what the hell is going on out there. We all are. But that wasn't even the most important piece of info. Jack hadn't seen the creature for a couple of months. Terry had his last incident several weeks earlier. This attack, though, it had happened 2 days earlier. Interview with James Knox. Name changed. I've added this transcript in its totality because it's short and because I felt like I shouldn't alter it. Okay, James, I've turned the recorder on so we are being taped. If you change your mind about that in any stage, just let me know, okay? Yeah, okay. Thank you, James. I understand that what you saw was very traumatic, so if at any stage you need to take a moment, please feel free. James nods. Why don't you start by running me through what happened just before you got to the river crossing? Well, I was just on my way home, really. Sun was going down and I'd had a rough day. Before you came to the actual scene, did you notice anything unusual? You know, I hadn't really thought much about that. I suppose everything was pretty normal. I've got to say I was pretty zoned out though. I drive that track every day, so I'm not always paying much attention. So there was no sign then of what was waiting for you up the road? No, nothing that sticks out. Just a normal drive home. Then I came around the bend to the crossing. What did you see when you did? Oh, not much at first. I was looking at the river. Well, it's not much of a river, more of a creek I suppose. But it gets pretty deep in spots and it can flow pretty quick. Most folks go to the main road because there's a bridge, but this way it's quicker for me. Anyway, when I looked back in front of me, I saw the truck. Just the truck? There was nothing around it? Not when I pulled up, but I could see there was no one inside it. I thought that was weird, but maybe he had ducked into the trees for a leak, so I jumped out to see if I could find the driver. That's when I saw the blood. James scratches his beard and closes his eyes. If you need to stop, I understand. No, it's just you never expect to see anything like that, you know? James takes a deep breath and a drink of water. It was all over the side of the car. A white truck, so it stood out. I couldn't look away for a sec, but I was pretty worried for whoever the driver was. I thought they must have cut themselves real bad getting out of something. I don't know. It sounds dumb now, but there's not supposed to be anything out here that can do that. James had become pale and requests a short break to gather his thoughts. Sorry, I must seem like a complete pansy. Not at all, James. It's fine. It's perfectly natural to be traumatized by what you saw. Thanks. Anyway, I might as well get it over with, eh? I looked around a bit, seeing if I could see any sign of the bloke from the truck. I honestly missed it at first. It just looked like meat when I noticed it. The grass of the truck is pretty long, and I was looking for a person. There was blood everywhere, all over the grass. It looked like one of those docos where the lion eats a zebra, or whatever. I couldn't control my feet, like I didn't want to go any closer, but my feet were moving that way by themselves. And what did you find when you moved closer? Just chunks, pieces. I didn't even recognize it as a person until I saw the feet. They still had boots on. Everything else, though, I threw up and ran, jumped back in the car and floored it out of there. I drove back. At this point, James paused and frowned. James, are you okay? Yeah. I just thought of something, is all. Something about the scene? Yeah, it was late in the day, so the sun was on the way down. Almost gone, actually. I had the lights on the ute when I peeled out of there to head back and get to the cops. There was this wattle across the river. Old shitty thing. Really low to the ground and really bushy. I must have blocked it out of my panic. When the lights flashed over it, I just remembered there was something there. Like lights reflected of eyes. My contacts also put me in touch with the ME's office, handling the body. The official report is yet to be completed, and the chief examiner, who had flown in, refused to even speak with me. But one of his assistants was a concerned local who slipped me her own autopsy notes, kept for her own portfolio. Over a coffee, I edited for content, names and locations, but her words are unchanged, so as it appears disjointed, that's on me. Medical examiner's notes. John Doe, believed to be Mr. Smith of 123 Town Road, based on the identification found at scene of death. Body found outside vehicle. Vehicle undamaged and running. Massive trauma not consistent with car accident. Subject completely decapitated. Head not recovered at scene. Confirmed identification not possible at this stage. Body presented in 3 large sections. Abdominal organs missing. Lungs and heart almost unrecognizable. Spine completely severed between L2 and L3. Several lumbar vertebrae also appear to be missing. Left leg separated from body at nexus of hip joint. Flesh surrounding wound is ragged, indicates tearing. Very little skin remains. A large amount of flesh appears to have been removed from the body, particularly the organs and the large muscle groups in the legs and gluteus. Left leg, which has been removed, shows almost no remaining flesh. Reports of blood on the ground at scene and little remaining in the body indicates severe bleeding at time of death. Forced to remove leg extreme. Hip joint severely damaged, wrenching force likely. Cause of death impossible to determine at this stage beyond severe traumatic injury. Marks on bone suggest consumption or scavenging of the body. Possible explanation for the flesh removal. Body does not appear to be old enough to indicate scavenger activity. Predation? By what? Notes from the scene indicate signs of struggle. Dr. Williams indicates decapitation from singular trauma as likely cause of death at this stage, but accepts that the remains are so badly dismembered we may not know. Hair of unknown origin found on remains. Dr. Williams organises to send samples to lab in Canberra, not on-site facility. Dr. Williams indicates farming accident as cause of death, fails to account for discovery of remains away from farms and farming equipment, fails to account for missing organs and flesh. Dr. Williams refuses to acknowledge his oversights, objections not noted on official records. Dr. Williams has arranged for the remains to be flown to Canberra for more extensive investigation. Remains sealed and placed under guard. All staff asked to leave the premises. It's vague, and to a point, because even in private notes, you don't want to put forth anything too crazy. But it was enough to set off a knot of dread in my stomach, knowing what I did about the sightings of a strange creature in the area. So, based on the assistant's notes, I did a little research of my own. I knew for sure it wasn't a farming accident. The decapitation of the body, like the carcasses elsewhere, along with the obvious signs of predation, ruled out that entirely for me. The pattern didn't match any of the known predators in NSW. It didn't, in fact, match any predators in Australia. We don't have many, to be fair. Dingoes are exceedingly rare around here these days, if not gone entirely. And much like wolves, they had a methodical approach to breaking down a kill, whether they brought it down or came upon a dead animal. Feral dogs are savage and lack any of the hierarchical sensibilities of wild canids at a kill, and that could explain the bestial way in which the remains seem to have been attacked. Of course, I don't know of any dog capable of decapitating a grown man with a singular traumatic injury, as the sitting ME apparently believed. Beyond that, the only other land-based predator in the whole country capable of taking a man is the saltwater crocodile, an animal we definitely don't have in NSW, and one that takes its kill into the river. That one terrible death opened up a whole bunch of questions, and it seemed that no one had any real answers. Rumours spread like a summer bushfire though, and enough people were on alert that when the beast showed up again a few days later, I found myself front and centre for the show. The Beast of the Barren Lakes, an unexplained news story that nobody wants to publish. Part 4 of 6. Let's get straight into that. They had finally, it seemed, cornered the terrible beast, but as before, when victory seemed assured, the beast slipped through their fingers. The hunting party fired and fired, so much so that there seemed to be no conceivable way for the beast to escape being struck, and yet, when they entered the clearing, there was no body, no sign of blood. Surely, they thought, this was their proof. The beast of Gévaudan to the people upon whom it preyed was nothing less than a devil itself. Excerpt translated from letter, unknown author, 1792. It seemed that the police had stopped taking reports of this creature seriously, and as a result my phone and email were inundated for the next week. I managed to track sightings roughly westward, although why anything would be heading that way at all I had no idea, Maybe this thing was headed for the rapidly dwindling lakes and rivers further out, or maybe for the desert itself. My own research into animals extant or extinct that could even remotely describe what had been seen came up mostly empty. There were a few similarities, but mostly impossibilities. And so I started looking into mythical stories, and that's when I remembered the Beast of Gévaudan. It had always been one of my favourite monster stories as a kid, but time had distorted the details. Rereading it though, so many things seemed to fit. Huge beasts, animal deaths, savage killings, decapitations. It seemed an almost perfect match, except that it had been in the south of France over 200 years ago. I guess, over hundreds of years, coincidence becomes much more likely. Still, I filed it away in my mind, just in case. Then I started putting the most detailed or interesting sightings in chronological order, hoping to guess the next move. I was sick of arriving after the thing had moved on. Date: 12th of the 1st, 19. Approximately 2000 hours. Location: withheld details. I was driving along the road near dusk when something on the shoulder caught my eye. The road here is a sharp dip between two small hills, so it was a bit darker than the road either side of it. It was hunched over a roadkill of some kind. I've never seen an animal like it. It was big and black, and for a moment I thought it might have been a feral pig. But then when it moved, it was no pig. It must have been almost as tall as the car, reported as a 2012 Holden Astra, in a hunched position. Before I got much more of a look at it, it shot off into the scrub so fast, like the high beam startled it. It didn't move like anything I've ever seen before. Date: 12th of the 1st, 19, approximately 23:30. Location: provided. Details: me and some of the boys were out the back of the farm spotlighting ferals. We had some sheep taken for a couple of nights, so we were on the lookout for the culprits, but weren't seeing much of anything. About 11:30 we hear this god-awful racket, kind of like this babbling scream, real close. Never heard anything like it, and we all sort of froze. I felt it in my chest. The bloke with the spotty starts scanning the tree line back and forth, really slowly, but we didn't see much. Just chalked it up to one of those sounds of the bush, you know. Every so often out here, something weird pipes up. It happens. So we kept driving around. A few minutes later, that same scream, louder and closer. It's like it's bouncing around the countryside. Sound out here is weird like that. But one of the boys, he reckons it kind of sounded like it came from behind us somewhere. So we turned the spotty back there, and holy shit, maybe 200 metres off or so behind the ute is this massive black thing. It looks at us for like a second, and then, name removed, panics and takes a crack at it. This thing tears off into the tree line faster than we can swing the light. It was on all fours and must have been maybe 5 feet high. Thick black fur and big eyes that shone green in the spotlight. The way it was behind us like that, I almost felt like it was stalking us. We got out of there real quick and haven't been back out since. Date: 14th of the 1st, 19, 2025. Location provided. Details: I saw a huge animal crossing the creek behind my farmhouse around sunset. It looked about the size of a large bull, but it was certainly not any sort of bovine. It had thick black hair, and all the way down along its back, the hair looked almost raised, like a razorback. Its legs were long and quite thick, and I think it had a tail. It was hard to tell because it was mostly walking away from me, so I also never saw the head. I thought it must have been a huge razorback, but then it leapt over the creek completely, and I realised it couldn't be any boar. The creek from the bank to bank is only small, at about 2 or 3 metres wide, but no boar can leap like that. Whatever this animal was, it crested the hill quickly and vanished from sight. Date: 16th of the 1st, 19, approximately 06:45. Location provided. Details: I'm a truckie. I've got myself caught up behind an accident on the highway and wound up running late. I was going to sleep at the truck stop, at location removed, but I must have been there 3 or 4 hours behind, and I was wrecked, so I figured I'd need to park up somewhere and catch some sleep. I pulled into a random rest stop before it got dark, cooked up a bit of food, and grabbed some sleep. I woke up around 6:30 in the morning to continue the trip. I lay there for a bit thinking about going and brushing my teeth and all that before heading up the road to find Brecky, and then I heard something outside. It was real quiet out there, no one else around, and I swear I could hear the huffing breaths. So I moved the curtains and climbed up front and damn near wet myself. Outside, sniffing at the bottom of the door, was a genuine monster. This thing would have come up to the window of the truck if it stood up. It was like dark brown and black and filthy. It must have smelled me on the inside of the truck, but it hadn't seen me yet, so I crawled back behind the curtains. The thing outside did something, and the whole cab shook. That takes some strength. It started scrabbling at the door, or maybe the step, and I was scared that it might try and get in, or realise the glass was breakable, so I yanked the cord for the horn and gave it a blast. This thing gives a horrible howl, and it stuck my head out from the curtain in time to see it heading off at a decent clip into the trees. And I took my chance. I got the truck out of there before it could come back. Didn't even stop for a piss until I'd gone about 200 kilometres. Date 18th of the 1st, 19. Time not given. Location provided. Details. I saw the creature cross the road in front of me at night. It came right to left across the highway, near location removed. When my lights hit it, it slowed down a bit and looked straight at the car. It wasn't there long enough for me to get a really good look at it, but it looked like it had pointed ears and some sort of snub snout thing. And it had big eyes that reflected the light really brightly. It was huge! And then it was across the road and I just kept driving. Date 19th of the 1st, 19. Approximately 0300 hours. Location provided. Details. We farm pigs, for shows and that sort of thing mostly, now that we're older. The land hasn't been much good for stock since the big drought of the late 90s. All told, we keep probably 30 pigs at any one time in a couple of barns and sheds around the place. This night in particular, I was woken up by a bit of a ruckus coming from one of the barns. I almost thought about checking it out, but cut it out pretty quick. Not even long enough to wake my missus, and I guess not long enough for me to really wake up and properly think about it either. Sometimes the pigs get a bit short with each other across the pens, or get startled by a fox or a possum snooping around, and I just thought that was what it must have happened. I heard the stories, but I never expected what I found in the morning. I just thought people were going a bit loopy. But then I woke up the next morning, and one of the sheds near the house had the back wall torn completely out. Even from a distance I could see the carcasses of a pig over one of the rails. When I got to the shed, at least 2 pigs were dead and the rest were nowhere to be seen. Whether they fled or were somehow taken, I don't know, but there should have been 6 large pigs in that shed and there were none. The bodies were in a proper state, torn up and shredded, and even just being sheet metal, it would have taken a lot of strength to destroy the back wall, and nothing natural can do that to pigs, not here anyway. It looked like a scene from that movie about killer lions back in the 90s. We rang the police, but they wanted nothing to do with us. And so, I'm reaching out to you because folks around the town tell me you're looking into all of this. I'm not sure what else I can turn. Date 21st of the 1st, 19. Time not given. Location provided. Details. We were having a bonfire on our farm at location removed, with a few friends. There was a fire ban, so I hope sharing this doesn't get the owners in trouble, but that's not the important thing. Late at night, when the fire started to mellow down and most people had gone to sleep in the shearers' quarters, we started hearing those horrible sounds off in the distance. There were howls, like a big dog, but other sounds too. Sometimes whatever it was shrieked, like how I imagine a banshee. Other times, it was like a gargling scream. We were all terrified and went inside, but it kept coming closer and getting louder. After a while we could hear it clearer. We could also hear it snarling and making this kind of barking growl or roar. It sounded really angry and really dangerous. We switched off all the lights, but no one was game to go out and put the fire out, so we just hoped it wouldn't attract whatever we could hear. Without the lights, it was really dark and we couldn't see anything, but we could hear it. It got to the point where it sounded like it was right outside, and then something brushed up against the shearing shed wall and snarled. I don't think any of us were breathing, trying to make no sound at all. Whatever was outside walked along the side wall, snarling and sniffing, and then as it walked out in front of a bit of a shadow, passed in front of the window as it walked by the last bits of the fire. Suddenly it gave such a loud howl that my ears felt like they'd burst. I don't know if it didn't like the fire, or it heard something, or what, but it let off this massive howl, and it must have headed away, because we started to hear it getting fainter again. In the morning, we could see the ground around the fire had been scratched at, but there was no sign of anything had even happened. Date: 25th of the 1st, 19. Approximately 2315. Location provided. Details. I think a creature was on top of my water tank last night. We have an enclosed porch, and in the summer, I like to sit out there and have a whiskey or two before bed. Last night, my dogs who live under the house started going off like nothing else. They'd never done that before. Even when foxes get in the yard, they tend to just snarl and growl or even ignore it. Last night, though, they were going crazy, and then they just stopped. One or two of them whined, and then I heard them shift further underneath the house. Then I heard a clang out by the tank. We don't have much light out at the back of the house, but I flicked on the yard lights anyway. I had a look around. Nothing on the ground. But right up on top of the old corrugated iron water tank, there was a dark shape. That was all I saw at first, and if it was just that, I wouldn't have thought twice. But then it must have opened its eyes, because clear as day, I got eye shine reflecting the yard light. It was looking straight at me, or at least at the house. And then it just jumped straight off the tank. Our old tank is about 6 meters tall on the top, and it just threw itself right off. I barely even heard it land, although it was definitely big, and then it headed off into the darkness somewhere. All of these accounts seem to be clearly linked to the animal I've been chasing, and they all took place along the path heading west and slightly north. Based on that, and based on the timings, I thought I might be able to intercept it if I got there fast enough. It seemed as though it would pass through a collection of mostly dry lakes and creeks within a day or two, and I resolved to beat it there. I really didn't know what I was in for, but I'd gone too far now, and I had to know. I honestly still don't know how I lived to tell the story from this point onwards. The Beast of the Barren Lakes, an unexplained news story that nobody wants to publish. Part 5 of 6. Let's get straight into that. When Jean Chastel finally killed the beast with his silver bullet, he spawned a legend. Many hailed him as a hero, and the attacks miraculously did indeed end. But still, the people would not be entirely satisfied, for Jean Chastel himself had a reputation as a beast, and some began to question his motives. Some said Chastel had raised the beast himself, only able to kill it because it trusted him. Some said that Chastel had loosed the beast and trained the monster to exact bloody and random retribution for some perceived slight, and others well. They said that the beast of Gévaudan, the loup-garou, had been Chastel himself all along. Albert Dumas, in a treatise regarding werewolves, 1813. Before I could follow the trail, our unknown monster had left. Someone knocked on my hotel door. A young guy stood there, maybe 5 or 6 years my junior, his jaw set but his eyes nervous. They widened a bit on seeing me. Have you been looking for the monster thing people have been seeing? He stammered. That's me. I smiled, trying to disarm him a little. How can I help? He looked puzzled for a minute, but quickly attempted a recovery. Sorry, I just expected, someone else. Can I come in? Or can we go down to a bar if you prefer? I'm sorry. Strange men asking to come in is probably not ideal. His awkwardness was kind of endearing, so I let him in. Thanks, I'm Aaron, by the way. He extended his hand, but tentatively, like he wasn't sure if that was the done thing. Tom, the stock hand, he's my brother. Was my brother. A sadness came over him then, as I took his hand and my heart broke a little. I'm sorry. Has there been any news? I knew there hadn't, but I felt like he could use a little hope. Aaron shook his head. I know he's gone. If he was even alive when he went into the brush. It'd been too long in this heat. That's why I'm here, actually. I want to help. With that his jaw set again, and his eyes hardened. He may have been young and a little awkward, but he had the spirit of a proper country boy, tough as nails. I heard you chasing this thing all over the countryside. I've got a 4-wheel drive and an ATV, and I've got a couple of 308s. He spoke with such venom that I doubted his intentions. Admittedly, a proper 4-wheel drive would be a lot more useful than my Toyota SUV, and the security of rifles that could drop a Razorback sounded awfully good, but I had no idea what I might find, and wondered whether I could deal with an impulsive young guy who wanted revenge. I sat Aaron on the small couch in the room and squeezed his shoulder. Look, Aaron, I understand that you're hurt and you're angry, especially when the cops are apparently pretending this whole thing isn't even happening. But whatever is out there is genuinely dangerous. I've got no idea where it comes from, what it is, or what it wants. But I know that tackling it fueled by emotion is only going to get people killed. So that's a no. He looked both angry and crestfallen, and so I tried to be more diplomatic. It's not a no. It's not a yes. Look at it from my perspective. A strange young guy I've never met finds me at my hotel and wants to help me find an animal that probably killed his brother using his 4-wheel drive and his guns. I don't know you at all. I don't even know what you or who you say you are. I'm giving you some advice, more than anything. I sighed. Let me ask around. Think of it like references for a job, okay? I've got a couple of hours before I have to get going, and I can think of a few people I can ask. Just hang out in a bar or something, and be ready to go, because if I do say yes, we'll be straight on the road. Aaron cheered up a bit, and then muttered his thanks, erratically shaking my hand as he stood and excited, promising that I wouldn't be let down. Secretly, I hoped he was right. The idea of running into the beast alone didn't sit well with me at all. Thanks to the barman and the pub manager, as well as his brother's employer, a few other town folk I'd built up a rapport with, and the wonders of social media, Aaron checked out. I still had concerns about his emotional state, obviously, but as the day wore on, I realised how foolish it would be to tackle this chase alone. Aaron seemed more relieved than anything, and I took that to be a better response than gung-ho excitement. At least, he didn't seem insane. Within the hour, we were on the road. Aaron behind the wheel of a large raised 4-wheel drive. His shyness had yet to evaporate, and so I asked him about himself in an effort to get him out of his shell a little. He had no issues talking to me once I had the question, which encouraged me. I wanted to have at least some kind of rapport with the guy if we were going to be hunting monsters. Then I realised how insane the whole thing was. I was a failed biologist turned journalist, hunting monsters. Holy shit. Aaron laughed when I mentioned it. Well, at least it's not boring. He started to warm to me a little after that, and we talked about growing up. We talked about his brother. He was well spoken, clearly smart, and seemed really interested in my path through life. Living out here, he said, there was really only ever one or two options. You farm with your parents, or maybe you do something else. But it always related to the land. Everything is about the land. I never got a chance to explore anything else. Would you have if you could? Hell yeah. I mean, the farm is what it is, but it's not exciting. Science sounds cool. Discovering things and all that, I think I could have done that and been happy. Is that what you wanted to be when you were little? He blushed a little. What? We all wanted something silly when we were kids, Aaron. It's not that, I kind of wanted to write plays, like Shakespeare. I couldn't help myself and choked out a short laugh. Aaron glared at me and went beet red. No, sorry, I'm not laughing at you. I promise. I just had this image of a guy in a flanny and an ancubra rounding up his cattle and shouting Shakespearean prose at them. It's just so incongruous. His glare turned to a grin and he burst out laughing. Anyway, what's so embarrassing about wanting to write plays? I think that's a great thing to do. Better than most kids. Well, I guess. It's just not the done thing, he said. It's not manly. Out here blokes are supposed to be blokes, you know? I was the weird kid who enjoyed Romeo and Juliet at school. And that got me quite a few bullies. Well, maybe when all this is over, you can write a play about it. It can be a horror story if we were right, or a black comedy if we wind up catching a stray Rottweiler. Around us, the country started to flatten out. Not yet truly desert. It may as well been after the scorching dry summer. Sun-bleached grass rippled in the hot breeze, and a desiccated scrub hissed and rattled as the wind blew through it and its parched leaves. We were surrounded by different shades of brown and red, and despite being oddly beautiful, it reminded me of just how remote and alone we would really be out here. Over 4 hours' drive from the nearest decent town. All alone in a path of a monster. The sun had fallen noticeably in the sky by the time we reached the dirt track Aaron said would take us into the heart of the rapidly evaporating lake country. Near the road, we were momentarily surrounded by a surprising burst of green, owing to the still-flowing creek system that spilled into the lake system when the rains allowed for it. Quickly, though, the landscape became arid and rocky, dotted with gnarled scrubs and the odd stunted eucalyptus. It looked almost Martian, with no real signs of life for miles around, but I was sure the beast would pass through here. We pulled up on a spit of land between two shallow, dry lake beds and began setting up. Before leaving town, we'd stopped in at a farm belonging to one of Aaron's uncles, a pig shooter. He had several carcasses on hand, and we'd taken a couple, hoping to use them as bait for the beast. Before the sun lost its heat, Aaron set about scattering the 4 carcasses around the campsite, no more than 250 metres away and no closer than 200. We wanted to be able to see and shoot the creature if it showed up, but we also wanted to be at a distance if we could. The sun still had an hour or so to bake the carcasses, creating what we hoped would be an irresistible scent in such a lifeless place. With little else to do until nightfall, Aaron decided to cook some food as the sun finally started to sink. It was a fine line. We wanted to attract the beast, but we didn't want to be caught out by it. I had no doubt it remained active during the day, but from our slightly raised position, we could see out over the lake beds for miles while the sun stayed up. It seemed like a good idea to eat whatever we could before the sun dropped, and with it, our visibility. We ate quietly, anxiety setting in. I didn't know if the beast would come through this particular night or not, but I felt certain that if it passed within smelling distance of that rotting meat, it would head straight for it. They say dingoes can smell carrion from 4 to 5 kilometres away, and from all reports this thing was much bigger than a dingo. As Aaron packed up the camp stove and the remaining food, I started a small, slow-burning fire with some of those hard-packed hardware store fire logs, made from sawdust. I'd heard the one story about the thing investigating a fire, and so I figured it couldn't hurt. Then we settled back into the back of the 4-wheel drive, seats flat and guns nearby, to watch a blazing red sunset and wait for whatever might come. The moon wasn't full, but in a cloudless sky, in the open, arid outback, it gave us plenty of light. Much more than I'd expected. I could almost make out the black smudge of at least 2 baits against the whitish salt deposits on the lake bed, which almost glowed with reflected moonlight. I almost started to worry that it might be too bright, but the creature had shown no signs of being overly skittish. Around about midnight, I started to drift off. Boredom had well and truly overwhelmed the nerves of earlier in the evening. You can catch 'em sleep, if you like. I'll keep watch for a few hours. I'm used to sitting out in the dark, waiting for pigs and foxes. Damn it, I had hoped Aaron hadn't noticed. Then again, that would have been hard, seeing as we were only sitting a few centimetres away from each other in the back of a 4-wheel drive. No, it's okay, I whispered, not sure how much noise I could safely make. I pull all-nighters more often than you'd think. Bad time management. I do wish we'd thought to make some coffee, though. Aaron held up a single finger, rummaging around under a folded seat, before coming back up with a thermos. Probably not much better than warm by now, but caffeine is caffeine, right? Holy shit, I could kiss you. I thought he blushed a bit at that, but I couldn't really tell in the darkness. The coffee was strong and lukewarm, and I slammed it down like a shot, letting the caffeine work its magic. Once it had, I turned to my companion. Maybe it was just the natural curiosity of a journalist, but based on our earlier conversations, I felt like I needed to understand him better. So, Aaron, you mind if I ask you a personal question? I mean, there seems to be a better than even chance that we could get eaten by that monster together. It's only fair that I get to know you a little. He chuckled nervously at my gallus humour. Sure, why not? I shifted into a more comfortable position, facing him instead of sitting so I could look out of the side window. What's your deal? Why are you out here? I get wanting to be here right now, but beyond that, you're obviously smart, well-spoken and well-read. You don't strike me as being happy to stay on the farm your whole life. You're not a kid either. You could do whatever you like, go wherever you wanted, so why stay? Aaron sighed, and for a moment I thought he might not answer. There's a few reasons. I guess family is one. It's hard enough to move away from them as it is, but I reckon it's harder for us country kids. I thought about leaving a lot, but I could never bring myself to. He paused, sipping his own, no doubt cold coffee. Beyond that, I think I felt like, as a kid, I needed to prove myself. I copped a lot of shit all throughout school. I was girly because I liked Shakespeare and Mike Twain, and poetry or whatever. I wasn't tough because I really didn't join the sports teams. I was less than a man because I never had a high school girlfriend. I suppose all that made me want to prove myself at the same thing everyone else was doing. Beat them at their own game, so to speak. If they were going to stay out here and work the land, then so was I. It might sound small-minded, but it was important to me. I think it's perfectly natural, especially you want to change the way people have belittled you in the past. I took a moment to scan the moonlight landscape, searching for any movement. Anyway, I bet if some of those high school girls could see you out here, ready to take on a vicious beast, they'd be a bit more interested. He broke into a full-on grin at that. Oh, the problem was they never had a lack of interest. It was mine. Oh! I found myself blushing this time, but Aaron saved me from making even more of an idiot of myself. Your turn. Biologist to travelling reporter of oddities. How does that happen? Isn't it hard on your family, partner, whatever? Well, I haven't got much of either, to be honest. I'm an only child, and my parents moved to New Zealand when I was at uni the first time, doing science. I guess I started that because I felt like it was a way for me to indulge the part of me that loved the idea that something could be hiding in the dark, or in the jungle, or in the deep seas, or whatever. When it turned out to be a lot more banal than that, I turned to stories and history. I felt like this way I could at least keep feeding that part of me that loved darkness. Well, you found plenty of that out here. Just then a sound cut through the whispered conversation. Somewhere out on the empty plain a howl, more powerful than I'd ever heard before, slashed the night silent air. Aaron and I shared a look, wide-eyed, as the howl rose to a ridiculous crescendo, far above what I thought an animal could create. As the terrifying howl died down, Aaron gripped my shoulder firmly and pointed slightly to the south. And at first, I couldn't really see what he saw, but as I squinted, I noticed a large dark smudge moving across the barren landscape. It appeared to be heading for the bait set 200 metres to the south, and, even at a distance, I could see my earlier joke about stray Rottweilers had been well off the mark. The beast had arrived. This creature was clearly much larger than any ordinary dog, and the way it moved as it got closer reminded me more of a hyena, loping and easy. It made a beeline for the carcasses and stayed at enough distance that I couldn't make out a lot of the details. Still, it seemed to give off an energy, or maybe my own body had a primal response to the beast. Looking at it filled me with a gut-clenching sense of fear and an uneasy, anxious nausea. Small hairs on my neck and my arms stood up with a prickling of goosebumps, and my muscles began to twitch. I realised They were flooding with blood as a result of adrenaline. My body wanted me to turn, to run. It recognised the situation, even if I didn't. In the face of the beast, I was nothing more than prey. Aaron, strangled into silence by fear as well, gently handed me a rifle. The original plan had been to open a door and fire from outside the four-wheel drive, but as I got the distinct feeling that had gone out the window, I had no idea how to fire from inside the car would affect us. But I was sure as shit I wasn't opening the door with that thing 200 metres away. It slid open the rear window and motioned for me to do the same with the middle window. Now, I've fired a few guns in my time, but in that moment, palms slick with sweat. I doubted whether I could hear the shed, let alone a moving target at 200 metres. Through the night vision monocular Aaron passed over, I could see my target much more clearly. Although details were still difficult to make out, it loped along like some kind of canine hyena hybrid, a distinctive and strange form of locomotion that made me think, briefly, of the alleged extinct thylacine. Any similarity to the legendary marsupial predator ended there, though the beast was far stockier and had thick, tufted dark hair. It ran with its head down rather than up as expected from any other of the canids that I knew. I thought of a wolverine or a badger, but longer, more languid and massively supersized. It had closed the distance to about 500 metres or so when it stopped. I heard it make the cackling, chattering scream that witnesses had reported, a demonic, alien sound so unnatural it made me feel ill. And then, to our horror, something responded in kind. Another chattering shriek rose from further away, somewhere to the northeast. We weren't dealing with one beast, we were dealing with two. And we were all alone in a barren wasteland, stuck square in the middle of them. The Beast of the Barren Lakes, an unexplained news story that nobody wants to publish. Part 6, the final. Let's get straight into that. Even now, some 200 years on, there are those who refuse to believe that the beast was a mere wolf. Some agree that Chastel had bred and trained a vicious, beastly dog. Others suggested that the descriptions of the animal indicate brown hyena or perhaps a sub-adult lion. Then there are the werewolf enthusiasts. As we veer into the preposterous, who believe that Chastel himself actually became the beast. One particular interesting theory, put forward in the years after the attacks, even suggested that Chastel had made a pact with the devil, summoning something truly evil and binding it within the body of a Gévaudan wolf, creating something halfway wolf and halfway demon. Unknown author. Website 2008. The second beast's call faded slowly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Aaron and I were dumbfounded, scouring the plane for any sign of the other visitor, while keeping one eye on the shadow of the first. "Is that it? Right back there?" I choked out, barely making a sound at all. Try as I might, I couldn't pick out anything that I could definitely identify as alive. My attention suddenly snapped back to the first animal. It had reared up on its two legs like a bear, no more than 100 metres from the carcass it had been approaching. My already thudding heart almost leapt out of my chest. On the ground, it looked large, but upright, it was massive. Maybe 7 feet tall, and as broad across at the shoulders as a country rugby player. It seemed to be scoping out the area. It couldn't have missed the car parked on an empty plain, but after a moment it dropped back down to all fours and crossed the remaining distance to the first bait in a flash. It didn't waste any time either, tearing straight into the carcass with a savagery we could even hear at the distance. Snarls and snapping bone were unpleasant of a soundtrack. And it got worse when the other one sounded off. It was much closer now, I realised. As I snapped my head around, somehow it had crept up almost to the carcass of the north side of us while we watched the other one. With ever-growing horror, I realised it was larger than the one to the south. If this one stood up, I'd have guessed it would have get to about 8 or 9 feet in height, and maybe 25% bulkier. It chattered and whooped like a demon tearing into its own meal. I am a fucking journalist. What the hell am I doing out here? I thought, overwhelmed by terror in the face of the beasts. Aaron's expression seemed to reflect my own, but to his credit, he gently took the monocular from me and focused on the closer, smaller creature. Sliding open a window as slowly as possible while still moving it, he motioned for me to move further towards the front of the car. I nudged my own rifle and inclined my head towards the other creature, but Aaron responded in a negative. For whatever reason, he wanted to take them one at a time. I deferred to him as the experienced hunter. Having opened the window, he eased the rifle out, sighting the beast and blowing out a steady breath. What followed was nothing but complete madness that's pretty blurred in my memory. The force of the shot in the semi-enclosed space kicked me in the chest and blanked my hearing for a few seconds. The beast at the end of the barrel twitched violently, rolling away from a direct hit and pouncing to its feet. The one behind us let out a violent shriek and then shot to a standing position, seemingly looking straight at the four-wheel drive. I had been concerned, in a way, that one or both of these creatures had been shot at before and had run. I didn't want to have to track it again, but for some reason they behaved differently this time. Its cry was answered by a wounded, enraged howl from the animal Aaron had shot at, and as the larger of the two tried to work out what had happened, then the wounded beast charged, straight for the car. It's amazing how small a distance 200 meters actually seems when something monstrous is charging headlong at you. It felt like the beast would be on us at any moment, but somehow Aaron managed to slam the bolt back and chambered another round. His next shot was true as the first, bowling the beast over, and his calm skill with the rifle surprised me as he sent the 3 remaining rounds into the sorely wounded monster before it could find its legs and feet. Then I found myself smashed against the inside of the four-wheel drive, safety glass showering my face as something hit it with tremendous force. With a bellow of rage, the larger of the two animals had rammed the car with enough power to lift it onto 2 wheels for a moment. Aaron yelled something, his voice unintelligible as it joined the crunching of glass and the roaring of the beast. The rifles had been sent clattering around inside the car, Aaron bouncing around with every enraged impact as he desperately tried to grab the unspent weapon. Finally, his hand closed around it, just as the beast shoved a wickedly clawed limb through the broken window, slashing his upper arm and eliciting a howl not too unlike its own. The fact that the creature didn't have proper hands probably saved him. Without the ability to grasp his arm, it simply pawed at him, unable to pull him closer. Every time he aimed the rifle, though, the thrashing paw nearly knocked it out of his hands, and he shouted some vaguely recognizable as vicious obscenities, and rammed the butt of the rifle into the searching limb, causing it to draw back. The head of the thing loomed above the roof of the car, out of sight, and I had a sudden flash of possibly suicidal inspiration. "The ATV!" I shouted. "We can't stay here. It's going to rip the car apart." He nodded as the creature dropped, trying to get its blunt head through the broken window. Trusting that it had been ready, I threw open the door on the other side of the car just as the remainder of the window gave in to the massive, savage head of the beast as it burst through. Aaron and I both managed to get out just before it could close those huge doors around either of us, and I put my head down and sprinted for the ATV faster than I'd ever run in my life. I jumped on the front and whipped my head around as Aaron piled onto the back with his rifle, just in time to see the beast extricate its head from the mauled car and send a smouldering glare in our direction. Nothing has ever made me happier than that ATV studding straight up. I don't think I'll ever be that happy again, and I'm completely okay with that. It had been a while since I'd driven one, and I had a momentary panic as I envisioned myself freezing under the pressure of being devoured right next to a perfectly functioning escape vehicle. But thankfully, that didn't happen. I let out a scream of raw triumph as we roared off into the dark night at a truly unsafe speed. The plan, roughly formed in my head, had been to get some distance between us and the creature so that Aaron could shoot it from a better, less immediately dangerous spot. I quickly saw, though, how difficult that might prove when Aaron tapped me on the shoulder and gestured behind us. Not only had the beast taken up the pursuit, it was keeping pace with the ATV, and, in the dark on the rough ground, I didn't think I could go much faster. "Can you shoot it on the move?" I shouted, and Aaron shrugged non-communically. "Is that a fucking yes or no?" No answer came, and I had to turn my attention fully back to where we were going. The land may have been barren, but I couldn't think of a worse time to put a wheel in a wombat hole and flip the bloody four-wheel over. Behind us, the thing giving chase had started that chattering cry again. "Fuck me, it's gaining on us." "What?" "I can't go any faster. It'd kill us both. So will that fucking thing." I wanted to scream. I knew the ATV couldn't go faster, but with the deceptive terrain and the dark night, I couldn't do it. With the beast now gaining instead of just keeping pace though, I didn't really have a choice. Just as I started to throttle the thing up, Aaron leaned into my ear. "Fuck it, we'll have to go into the lake bed." I looked to the left. Across the wide expanse of flat land, it would be a huge risk. There could be thick mud underneath the crust, ready to trap us like flies in honey. But if it stayed hard, we might have a chance. Of course, it would also involve slowing down and turning left, giving the monstrous beast a chance to get even closer. "When we turn, slow down for as long as you can," Aaron said. "I'll have a chance at hitting it, maybe." I wanted to snap back something about how useless maybe was in our position. But he'd already started getting himself into the best position he could to shoot a rifle on a moving four-wheeler driven by a journalist. I probably made it difficult, if I'm honest, but I followed his instructions and made the turn. I couldn't help but look towards the creature as I did, and once again, I regretted it. The eyes shone in the moonlight, silvery and savage orbs set in a blindingly fast shadow, and then a rifle cracked and it stumbled. Maybe, more out of hope than realism, I thought Aaron might have pulled off a miracle kill shot. I almost stopped, but the beast gathered its feet rather than falling. I swore and gunned the engine again, but this time the monster did something different. I'm not sure if the death of the other one had rattled it, or if the shot had genuinely wounded it, but instead of coming back at us, it swerved hard to the west, loping off into the night and quickly dropping down to the slightly raised land between the lakes and out of sight. For the last time being, at least, we could breathe again. We made our way back to the campsite slowly and diligently, hyper-aware of our possibility of an ambush. On the way back, we stopped to try and gather up the body of the dead creature. What we found, though, made absolutely no sense. It was a dog. Nothing but a normal, everyday dog. Little bigger than I'd expect, sure, but definitely not the massive animal that we both saw. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, but Aaron pointed to the tracks in the dirt, huge pawed pug marks that didn't match the dog in any way. We weren't losing our minds, but there were so many questions. Unfortunately, we had very few options. The damage to the four-wheel drive was extensive, and we couldn't shelter there with a wounded monster on the loose. We didn't know if it would start, and the damage meant that we would have to change a wheel before we could go anywhere. Not something we could really do given the circumstances. Plus, a wounded animal is often the most dangerous, and we didn't know who else might be within the range, or where it might head next. I'd already come to the same conclusion, but Aaron voiced it. We're going to have to track it and end it properly. When his brother went missing, the creature had seemingly left very little evidence of its passage. This time, though, it seemed far less cautious, or maybe it couldn't avoid leaving a signal on the brittle surface of the dry lake bed. Either way, it left an obvious trail for us to follow, and we slowly stalked it across the dried lakes on the four-wheeler as the sun began to rise behind us, always heading west. The rising sun gave me a bit more confidence. Visibility improved, and the creature would find it much harder to hide in the shadows of the dark, rocky landscape. With an injured, violent animal somewhere ahead of us, any advantage it had lost made me feel much better. Try as we might, though, we couldn't seem to catch up, even as the sun rose higher and the heat of the day set in. Eventually, we had to stop and at least eat something. A long night of fear had taken its toll, and I could easily have dropped right there and slept even with the beast still out there. A few kilometres along, the ground became harder again, and the tracks became harder to follow. Aaron, the hunter, had to get off the ATV and track on foot, with me nursing the vehicle along behind, looking out for any trouble. A few kilometres further, and we ran into a problem. It had been dry out here for a long time, but when rain does come, it comes in torrents. Often, all that water finds a weak spot in the arid soil, and within days, it can erode deep ravines as that rain makes its way into the river system. At about midday, we found ourselves standing on the edge of one of those ravines. Not a particularly wide one, mind you, maybe 12 feet across and 7 or 8 feet deep, but enough to stop us in our tracks. Try as we might, we couldn't find any sign that the beast had turned away either. It seemed like it had gone over the ravine entirely, and worse, there didn't seem to be any way around the ravine anywhere nearby. We'd failed to chase the thing down, and it had gotten away. I hung around for a few more days, looking for any sign of the creature in the news out west. I wrote up a story, leaving out some of the more preternatural elements and focusing on the mysterious attacks, and in the last few weeks I submitted it to everyone I'd worked with for opinion. They all shot me down with odd phrases like, "This article would not be in the best interests of the publication." I've never heard that said before, especially given I write stories about strange things exclusively. As for the creature, it seemed to have vanished, and I had to get home at some stage, so after almost a week with no more news, I figured I couldn't hang around any longer. I said my goodbyes to Aaron, left him my number in case anything new came up, and set off home. 3 days after I arrived home, I received a phone call from someone within the Australian Federal Police. They were courteous enough, explaining that they had information I'd been involved with a feral dog incident out near Griffith, and wondering if I minded answering a few questions. I played along with a conversation that seemed reasonably normal, except that the AFP don't usually get involved with that sort of thing, and the words dangerous feral dog were repeated far too often. I felt as though the caller was trying to convince me that a feral dog had been the only culprit. I couldn't help but be unsatisfied in a weird way. I had touched on something I felt was preternatural, some creature well beyond the norm, and I had nothing to show for it, but a story that no one wanted to hear. The beast itself had left no evidence that might allow me to answer the questions I still have. Instead, I started scouring cryptid encounters again, hoping to find something that I could relate to what we'd been through. A lot of them were junk, clearly embellished or outright made up, but two had enough similarity to the case out west that they caused me to dig deeper. Neither had happened in Australia, but I'm not sure that matters. I don't think these events are tied to a place as such. The most recent happened in Malawi, 15 years ago, where a terror beast killed and maimed some 20 people, and the other being the killings of Gévaudan in the 1700s that I wrote briefly about earlier. In both incidents, the killers were savagely beyond normal predatory behaviour. Descriptions of the killers were very similar between both and seemed to fit our beast well. Of course, I could easily have dismissed these correlations as coincidental, if not for the way both cases ended. In Malawi, they shot a hyena. In Gévaudan, 2 wolves were killed. These animals matched neither of the description of the beasts or the patterns of their attacks. The villagers in both cases were well aware of what these native animals look like, sound like, and how they hunt. In both cases, they were convinced that the beast was not the normal animal. In the dried lakes of the western Riverina, we'd shot a bona fide monster, only to discover the corpse of a feral dog where it fell. In Malawi and France, some blamed witchcraft, claiming that black magic had been used to turn an animal into something more. I have no idea about all of that, but I do know that the body of that dog lay in the midst of the tracks it could not have made. Something unearthly happened out there in the barren lands bordering the Australian desert. Something I doubt I will ever be able to explain. I feel like we might never know how many times this has happened, given my call from the AFP, but I do know that we have 2 other recorded events that seem to match almost perfectly over the course of history. Who knows how many more have been lost, never heard, or explained away. This is not the first time something like this has happened, and I'm certain it won't be the last. Wow, fantastic stuff, CreepyAus. The author there, CreepyAus, absolutely phenomenal author. I think this is about the 3rd or 4th story of CreepyAus's that I've actually covered. I've been sat on this one for quite a few months, just trying to find the time to record this week has been murder. As you might know, over in England we still have our kids at home for the 6-week school holidays. So looking forward to getting my studio back where they're not trying to play Minecraft, etc, etc. But anyway, As ever, guys, I hope you're all well and happy. And above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.